Aloha, everyone. I'm your host, Christina Mitri, and welcome to Smart Living Hawaii's podcast, where we discuss smart homes and technology, sustainability, healthy lifestyles, and smart business. Today, we will continue our Sustainable Leaders series and have a talk story with Kevin Nute, a professor and an architect who brings health and well-being into a home and workplace through design. It's a very interesting concept, and our goal today is to explain this mostly visual concept through words on a podcast for our listeners. So, aloha, Kevin.
Aloha, Christina.
Hi. Thanks for joining. Today, we're actually doing a Zoom recording. We do have this being recorded for audio strip and also video. We'll see if we're going to be posting the video or not, but we definitely will have it for the podcast. So before we begin, I always like to share our guest speaker's bio, and here's a really short one really quick. Kevin teaches the history and theory of architecture at the University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. He received his architectural training at the University of Nottingham before working in practice in London, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and earning his PhD at the University of Cambridge. We also have here that Kevin spent his earlier career in Japan, first as a visiting research scholar at the University of Tokyo, and later as an associate professor at Muroran. How do you say that?
Muroran. Most Japanese don't even know that term, right? Muroran.
Yeah, I wasn't too sure which one to roll. Institute of Technology. He has won numerous architecture awards and prizes. He's an author, and we will go into detail on one of his books called Naturally Animated Architecture. And it's a really cool book. It does have visual aids with it. And we will put it on for the video portion of this. And you'll also have the website as well later that you can go check out as well. So let's dive into Kevin. And with our listeners, we always like to say, growing up family-wise and a lot of your background, I usually like to ask that question with you. So where did you grow up?
Some people say I haven't yet, but I'll cross over that. Theoretically, in the southwest of England, so the little peninsula that juts out into the Pacific below Wales, a place called Cornwall. That's the county anyway.
Awesome. And what does Kevin like to do for fun?
I like to do this kind of thing for fun, talk about my work. So that's kind of a sad commentary on an academic, I suppose. But I like team sports, watching them, So because I'm from the UK, then soccer is a big deal. Rugby, anything with a ball in it, other than golf, I'll watch. I still follow, after the news, it's the BBC Sport website is the next one I go to this day. Oh, yeah.
Well, so family here in Hawaii, or is everybody in a different country?
Yeah, I have no family here. I have one sister in Florida and one brother in Asia, and everyone else is in the UK. So I have a total of 6 siblings. Very lucky. So 3 brothers and 3 sisters. So
how has it
I'm
been
6
during
or 7.
Have you been able to see anybody?
No, it's been bizarre. I've only been here 2 years, and it's been 18 months of COVID. So I've seen a lot of my apartment, but not much else. So I got a lot of work done, but I am looking forward to actually getting out a bit more. Put it that way.
Awesome. Well, let's just dive into my question I usually ask most of our guests is, how did you get into the sustainable world? Because I know we first met with a group that's working with bamboo and its sustainable measures. So I'm assuming besides just architecture, you have a heart for sustainability. So I was curious as to what brought you to this world of sustainability and
it's a great question. It's inevitable, that I think in almost every profession now, especially given yesterday's announcements. It's impossible to just continue the way you are in any profession, I'd argue, and ignore, the stark kind of circumstances that we find ourselves in. So architecture has been talking about these issues for at least 2 decades or more. And it's become a dominant topic and rightly so, because unless we address it in every field, then there'll be nothing to address. So it's my take on it is that it's an extremely serious topic, but it doesn't have to necessarily be or to lack enjoyment or fun. In other words, there are different ways of approaching a serious topic, and I prefer to do it not to make it trivial, but to make it poetic in the way that it's introduced, but it doesn't change the seriousness of what we're talking about.
Correct. So what we are going to tackle today is you are well into architecture, and it's actually, I would say, within the sustainable world, a lot of what we're looking at on the real estate side is a green home with energy efficiencies, a high performance home. I mean, you got the solar, you have, the air quality control, you've got, all of these smart features that, add to a high performance home. And even the way that you design the home to take in the natural elements. So this is going to be a different topic and I would say a new one for a lot of people in this green space and even green builders. And I think this is why I'm really interested in sharing it, because it's a concept that is new to most people, but it has been around for a while and it makes sense. So I guess if we can just dive right in to what it is that we're talking about. I believe the book that you wrote, The Naturally Animated Architecture, could you just give a short description of this so people understand?
Yeah, I'm really tempted to share my screen, but clearly people are not going to be able to see that on the podcast. But what I'm really advocating is that the weather has typically been perceived as, especially in other parts of the world, less so in Hawaii, but still to a large degree, as the enemy, quotes, something that architecture is designed to shelter us from and protect us from. And that hasn't changed, of course, but it's a massive oversimplification. The argument of the book is that there are many elements of the atmosphere outside that we as a species have become physiologically dependent upon. And to make a hard line between indoor space and outdoor space means that, sure, we're protected from extremes, but we're also throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. We're denying ourselves some important things that we actually need to sustain our well-being, like direct contact with wild nature and perceptible change. And those are things that there's plenty of research been done on that we need psychologically and physiologically, and that we go out of our way to seek. We go to the beach, we go to the mountains, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm arguing, well, when we can't go to the beach or go to the mountains for whatever reason, can architecture actually invite those things in? And I've shown in the book lots of practical ways that we can do that without sacrificing our shelter.
Yes, and let's see, I guess to put it into perspective is, the way when you were explaining it to me and the way I kind of see what you mean by this type of architecture, or a way that you can add these elements into your living space, or perhaps an office space that doesn't have these natural elements. I think it would be like how everybody would have to or need that connection to nature, right? Or be able to live and breathe it. And like, what's the number one, I guess, punishment when you're in jail, right? It's like being put in the hole, right? So, I mean, that would
Exactly.
probably be the
Yeah.
most best
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, yeah, I know it's one I've often used. The technical term for that is sensory deprivation, and it was a torture of choice. For all I know, might still be, where you basically deny people any knowledge of day and night, and they get no change in their environment, and they slowly go nuts. Not surprisingly, because we're designed to be in sync with our environment. And when you deny people those connections, they start hallucinating and they become very susceptible to being, I don't know, persuaded, put it that way. Now, I'm not arguing that architecture subjects us to sensory deprivation, but I am arguing that it subjects us unintentionally to persistent sensory restriction, which is kind of shocking in itself. In other words, without knowing it, a lot of the spaces that we occupy, and we occupy indoor spaces now well over 90% of our lives, okay, which is probably surprising to most people. And after COVID,
before or after COVID?
that was before COVID, that was in the 90s, and that was the EPA's number, right? You can imagine, and irrespective of COVID, with this generation who spend more time online, the number of hours outdoors is shrinking and shrinking. Which makes indoor environments all the more important, because that's really the human environment now. The amount of time that we spend in the original environment that we evolved in is now a tiny fraction of our lives. Where you've got a species that was evolved to thrive in an environment like the one outside, and now that species has decided, for social and cultural reasons, to spend the vast majority of their existence in a completely artificial environment. And not surprisingly, that something has to give, because it's imperfectly adapted. Indoors is not outdoors. So the argument that I'm making is, can we make indoors still protect us, still enable us to do things, without getting wet and feeling uncomfortable, et cetera, but without denying ourselves the perceptible change, which is a big element of the outdoor world that we are designed to respond to, and this connection with wild nature that we seem to crave. In other words, we can bring potted plants and a tank of fish, a pet dog or cat into our indoor environments, of course, and they help. There's plenty of evidence that they do help, but they're not the same as the experience of going and immersing yourself in a wild environment where, the critters don't depend on us, the environment existed before us and will exist after us. And it's a rather different experience, and one that we seem to enjoy. I think the technical term for that is the sublime, where it makes us feel that we are not in control, and the weather is one of it is by far and large the largest wilderness on our planet. People talk about wilderness areas, but they neglect the fact that our atmosphere is one continuous wilderness. We share it. We're in the process of damaging it, of course, but it is extraordinary because it is out of our control, as it's demonstrated, right? So there's a good side to that wildness can be something that we can actually benefit from, and that's what I'm trying to do in this research.
Okay, so what I wanted to go into was, now that you kind of explained what it is we're talking about bringing the nature into our space, because in general, architecture was created to keep out the earth elements, to protect us from it, right? So we can, not get rain on our heads, and, the wind isn't cold, or the snow outside, which obviously we don't tackle, which ends up being, for the majority of the world, something they have to deal with every year. Not only that, but it probably keeps them indoors for a big portion of that time during the winter. So then they can't go out, and they can't do what it is we could probably do every day. Although we have to schedule it. I mean, I have to schedule going on a trail run this morning just to get outdoors and absorb that feeling.
Yep.
Whereas some people, there's not necessarily the time of day. So could you give us some examples of ways that you can, maybe either you're doing it yourself, or maybe even an architect would put this this concept into play on something they're creating or they're going to build for somebody?
Yeah, again, I'm aware of the fact that most people are not seeing visual images, but I hope that the video of this will be shown. It might be easier for me to describe while we're looking at something. Is that okay, Christina, if I shared my screen right now? Okay, let me just show you. This is
for those of you that are not, that are obviously listening to the podcast, if you're not driving and you're listening to the podcast at home, you can go to this website, which is www.vitalarchitecture.org. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thanks, Christina.
And then you will be able to see, it's like maybe a 2.5 minute
right.
flip through of a book that he wrote that has video, video.
Right. Let me, you'll see exactly the same video as the one I'm going to talk over right now. But so when this one starts, so these are extracts from the book, and there are videos in the book. It's an ebook as well as a print book. And the videos in the print book you can access via a smartphone. But all of these images are examples of natural change. In this case, they're wind animated foliage, for example, being back projected or projected onto indoor spaces. Sorry, we've got some sounds in the background here. And so the movements then that would normally be outside can be effectively brought indoors, not the actual wind, but movements created by the wind. We're now looking at some examples of wind affecting water, and then reflections of that water being projected into indoor spaces. So what I'm talking about is bringing the movement of the weather, in this case the wind, indoors, without necessarily bringing the wind itself in, unless it's welcome. So if you're in Pittsburgh and it's midwinter, you may not want the wind, but you could still get the movement of the wind without sacrificing your protection from the weather. Likewise with sunlight, in a very hot climate, you may not want that. Oops. Okay. We'll stop the sound on that. So rainwater harvesting, which is what you've just been listening to, is another example where that local harvesting of rainwater for local use, rather than it being centralized, can be made visible, and the change, the movements of rainfall can effectively be brought indoors, again, by light projection, either sunlight or after dark by artificial light, projecting that movement into indoor spaces. So I'm very aware of the fact that the video makes a lot more sense than a verbal description, but basically I'm using the apertures of a building, the windows, etc., to filter change that's naturally in the outdoor weather, the movement of the wind, rainfall, the movement of sunlight, and to bring in that movement without necessarily bringing in the sunlight directly or bringing in the wind directly, or certainly not bringing in the rain directly. So I'm basically, as I said, filtering and extracting that natural movement. And that natural movement is very special because it doesn't distract our conscious attention. Unlike artificial change, a baby's cry, a human voice, a siren, that's designed to get our attention, and it does, and it's very distracting. Whereas we don't stop what we're doing when we see the movement of the wind in a tree, right? We're so used to that it can keep us stimulated. It kind of keeps us ticking over. It keeps us our attention active, but it does not distract us from whatever it is we're trying to do, learn or do a job or whatever. And that's a key part of this research, is to say, that natural change is special because it has this capacity to renew us. And there's an area of research called attention restoration theory that has shown that exposure to nature renews our ability to concentrate, to focus. And it does so, according to the theory, because it doesn't tax our conscious concentration then, whereas other things we have to focus on. I'm not sure if that makes sense to you, your listeners, Sheila. Christina.
Yeah, I think you did a very good job. And I guess a lot of this type of movement, if you didn't see it on the actual video part of it, is it's a lot of shadows, I would say, of things that are happening. Like, when there's wind blowing and it's a fern that's in the background and the shadows that are up on the wall, and that is something maybe happening outside, but it's coming in. And so there's a lot of these type of I would say passive, like subconscious things that are going on. And whether we realize it or not, this actually helps maybe our brain in some capacity to maybe help us if we're, in a work environment and our boss wants us to keep working and not take that 15-minute break. I don't know, maybe it'll help on that. Or maybe you have a deadline to do and you need to concentrate, right. And maybe this helps a little bit more than getting out for that extra 15 minutes that you may need. And there's studies that show this. So that's a little bit of, I guess, my interpretation of what you're trying to get across.
No, that's exactly right. We did experiments on this, and we were able to show that these natural patterns of movement calmed people. Their heart rates were statistically lower, and they were also able to focus. They performed better on attention tasks than when they either didn't have any stimulation or there was an artificial stimulation. So it isn't just theoretical that we did. We did a series of experiments.
Awesome. And these most likely for the passive subconscious type of sensories that I know we were discussing before when we had met, we're basically audio, visual, and possibly smell, right? Depending on the smell. And maybe you could explain why touch and taste wouldn't really apply.
Yeah, it's a great question, Christina. We have the body has three technically remote senses, right? Sight, hearing, and the olfactory. And it has to be remote, right? Because, the whole point is if we want to be sheltered from the weather, we can't be directly in the weather, right? So, otherwise there's no point in having architecture. Just go outside and stand in the rain or stand in the wind and,
well,
and that's good.
See that a lot of, if you didn't see the video audio, the audio, I mean, the video of what you guys have, you do these type of where you're bringing these elements in. It's also not just an architectural design. It's almost like an art, and it's very pleasing to the eye, and it catches. It's aesthetically pleasing. So it's almost like add-on architectural design that
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you could liken it, Christina, to natural painting. Where the architecture or a blind inside the glass, right, is actually being, and we've all seen these effects serendipitously, by accident. And I'm basically saying, well, we could actually make this happen by design, right? But if you've ever seen the silhouettes of foliage on the back of blinds, it's kind of like a natural painting, right? I mean, and it's animated because the wind is moving the tree, so it's even better than a static artificial painting, because we don't know when the sun will go back in and the image will get faint or even disappear, and we don't know when the wind. So it has dimensions to it that regular art wouldn't have, right? It's an animated, but it has this key component that the movement we know is naturally generated. And we did experiments where we set up an artificially generated tree, right, a digital tree, and a naturally wind generated one. And people were not able to tell the difference between but when we told them that one was natural and one was mathematically generated, their perceptions of which they liked, not surprisingly, completely reversed, right? And so it's not just that natural movement has these positive effects. We can replicate that artificially, but once somebody experiencing that understands that this has been artificially replicated, the positive benefits are much reduced, right?
It
the
almost
analogy,
makes sense and to really use the natural elements as to your benefit as much as you possibly can versus replicating, unless that is your only alternative.
Right. I mean, you put it perfectly, Christina, because the analogy I usually use is when you notice a beautiful flower, you walk up to it and then you see the giveaway plastic little nib where it was put in the mold. And most of us go, oh, it's fake, right? And our opinion of it drops. But from a distance, we were completely fooled. So you can replicate it, but once we know, we don't value that flower and we don't value the movement the same as if we know that it's being naturally, and it's as if we don't trust ourselves, but we trust nature and we trust something that is independent of us. Then, and the place where the artificial could be very, very useful is if you're traveling in space and you don't have real wind and rain available, but other than that, I think there's a strong argument, as you said, for using natural movement wherever you can. There are things you can buy, expensive artificial windows that will give you a view of anywhere in the world. You could live in Pittsburgh and have a view of Hawaii and have it, have the wind and but you would know that you're not in Hawaii, and that would have a big effect on its benefits, I think. In fact, I know.
Totally understand. So with the touch and taste side of things, I guess where I was going is that those things are not passive or subconscious. You actually, as a person, right, would have to stop what you're doing if you were working. Oh
yeah, my apologies, Christina. Yeah, I went off on a tangent there, but you're right. Yes, they do require active. You were using the word passive in a way that I'm not familiar with, but I should know. Yes, they require you stopping what you're doing, right? Whereas we hear and we smell and see. Yeah, thank you for that. I was missing one. Without having to stop. There is a connection, though. There's something very special about the fact that we are a seeing species. Your dog, my dog, when I had a dog, they are primarily a nose on four legs, right? Whereas, we are seeing creatures. And so there's a reason why most of the movement that I'm encouraging to come indoors is visual. I'm aware that some people wouldn't be able to see that, and so sound could be very important for them. But the visual is democratic. We can look away if we find it distracting or we don't want to look at it, and we can even close our eyes. Whereas if a sound comes into a space, our body is not equipped with anything of its own that will, apart from covering our ears with our hands, right, or a smell. So everybody needs to be on the same page. If you let a sound in, everybody needs to be cool in that space with that sound, right? Wind chimes, for example, right? Some people like wind chimes. I'm not a fan myself. They're naturally generated, but it's an unnatural sound in many cases, and I find it distracting, right? I don't find the sound of the wind in palm trees or any other kind of tree distracting because I'm so used to it. But the artificial sound of a wind chime. So, and that was where I kind of misunderstood your question. But yes, so the visual is the most important. sound would probably be the next most important, particularly after dark, when obviously it becomes more difficult to see change in the environment. You can do it with artificial light.
So I would just assume then, and I was going to ask this question early on, but I forgot to, is if you had to say goodbye to one of your senses, what would it be?
Oh, wow, what a question. That's a great question. Wow. That's so difficult.
I know, right? I had to think about this too, because we were talking, last time we talked, it made me think.
That's like asking me
Okay,
which
here, I'll
eye,
ask the first
which
question.
eye I prefer. You know, it's like, I like them both, you know.
If you had to pick the most important one to you, what would it be?
Oh, the visual, I think, for sure. Yeah, for the reasons I've just explained, the visual. So tactile, and then I think tactile might be, what was the other one? Taste. No, I couldn't get rid of taste. I think it might be tactile. I feel bad. I mean, you know, yeah, I mean,
Touch.
given.
I couldn't get rid of touch.
What would you get rid of? I mean,
touch that if you got rid of.
What would you get rid of?
I would get rid of taste. I was thinking about it, and it was going to have to be taste, which is very sad, but
well, there's a lot of people out there who could probably tell you exactly what that feels like right now. So you might want to consult
I know,
them.
after a lot of people lost their sense of taste from COVID, right?
You know what? That's a great answer. I should have said that. You know, we should rewind and I say taste, because I'm English and, you know, we don't really care about food. You know, so.
I mean, maybe I might lose weight if I lost my sense of taste.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah. Your answer is way better than mine.
Well, I had a little time to think about it. I didn't give you these questions.
That's a great question. I think I'm gonna ask my students that right off the bat and just watch.
That would be a really good, yeah, it would be a good icebreaker for the start of, well, if you have.
Absolutely, I'm gonna definitely use that.
So anyways, I was just trying to break things up here, and let's see, I was trying to dive into a couple more things before we jump off. Let's see. I had taken so many notes when we last spoke because I was learning so much. So I wanted to make sure we cover a lot of this stuff because it was things that I think a lot of this isn't so much that we didn't know about it. It's just we didn't realize that this could have an impact on our well-being, right? And
yeah, I think that's different. I think that's enormously important. There is one thing that I wanted to get across, Christina, is that there are these psychological and physiological benefits that have been proven of bringing natural change into our environment. Otherwise, the brain, rather like a computer, will just go to sleep or start daydreaming. So it needs to be regularly stimulated. Otherwise, we're designed to say, well, nothing is changing in this environment. I'm just going to go to sleep, or I'm going to start thinking about what I did yesterday. It's hard to focus. We're not designed naturally to spend 8 hours sat in one place focusing on one thing. You know, that's a machine. It's not a human being. So if you force a human being to do that, they're either going to be goofing off or they're going to be taking regular breaks to self-medicate, gaze out the window, go to the bathroom, have another cup of coffee, answer their email for the 20th time in an hour. Whatever we do, right? We're just, you know, we can't focus. So what natural change can do is to reboot, give us a little micro rest so that we can continue without really being consciously distracted. But there's another component, as well as the psychological and physiological benefits that are proven of bringing natural change into what, if you look around you now, I guarantee that most of your listeners, the space they are in, apart from their own movement, is completely static. And that is absolutely not the environment that human beings are supposed to be in. And that describes 99.9999 recurring % of all indoor spaces in the world. You know, so there's a huge mismatch between the living organism and the environment that we now put that living organism into. So what I'm saying is, hey, we can recalibrate and we can bring the indoor environment. We're not going to make it exactly the same as outside. Otherwise, why have a building? But we can bring elements. We can bring much more than we currently do of the outdoor atmosphere. And that enables us to to remain happy psychologically and physiologically healthy when we can't get out and self-medicate it by going to the beach or the mountains or going for a hike or whatever, because we've got
I wrote down some of these that you had mentioned and things that I've thought of too, that maybe things that, you know, everyone could incorporate themselves or not. So maybe you can chat on this one, but you had last time spoke about micro courtyards and how
so there are 3 distinct ways, and I could share something else with there'll be viewers, I hope.
What about a sound of a fan?
Well, artificial. So, we don't associate that with nature. That's an artificial sound.
But would you say, because some people, just white noise in general is helpful to them, and why is that?
I think white noise might help you to sleep, or it could be that it's unintelligible and that we're not searching for meaning in it, right? Normally, if we know that something is artificially generated by a human being, we're wired to search for meaning, which is why if you've ever been in an environment where somebody's speaking a foreign language that you don't understand, it's really distracting because your brain is trying to extract information because we're programmed to do that, but we can't, right? Whereas we don't attempt to extract information from white noise or the sound, the breeze in the trees. That's my best guess. I'm not a psychologist, but I work with several.
What about waterfalls and those water features that people?
They definitely they're natural. The sound of falling water it would count as natural. Micro courtyards, going back to your question, Christina, can be really useful. I mean, there's an example, traditional example in Japanese architecture called the subo niwa, which subo is 2 tatami mats, and niwa means garden. And so these are tiny gardens that were not designed for you to actually get into, except to take care of the plants, which you did once in a blue moon, but to sit around and look into, right? So they could be just 6 feet by 6 feet, right? But it was a way that the wind or the rain could be brought into the middle of a long urban house, and it was a way of kind of getting your fill or contact with nature in the middle of a dense city. And that could still be done. It can still be done. And of course, we could put a pane of glass around it. If you were in Pittsburgh, you probably would want to do that, maybe 2. But in some places, during the summer, you could open it up. But the point is, if it's glazed, it would feel the movement of the rain, of the wind, of the sun in that space would feel, to all intents and purposes, like it was indoors, even though it's actually on the other side of the glass. So it's very different from seeing it, out there. And if the courtyard is small enough and the glazing is open in the sense of it's not broken up with lots of glazing bars, etc., it can really feel like it's indoors. I do wish I could illustrate this. In fact, I might. Let me just one more sharing here, because it's a great way to see that. So these are the 3 examples, and you can see the courtyard on the left. And this is a traditional Japanese tsubo niwa. So the movement of those bamboos, it really, even when the glazing is pulled across, it really feels like it's part of the interior space. It's so small. Then in the middle is outdoor movement of foliage, wind animated movement being projected onto an indoor space. And then on the right, what we were talking about a bit earlier, Christina, this is the movement of plants several yards away, but it's being projected by the sun onto this blind, which is inside the space. So all 3 of these, I would argue, are perceived as being indoors, even when they're actually, technically they're not. I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah.
So the courtyard that you were showing was like that micro courtyard. Was it actually an inside courtyard with like, I guess the lighting on the top was what keeps it alive, I guess, versus.
No, that courtyard was outdoors.
Oh,
In fact,
okay.
it's very subtle, but it was actually raining, which was what was making those bamboos move. So you could see it was very, very small, but it was outdoor space. But it was outdoor space that was surrounded by indoor space. And when you get, it has to be small, right, compared to the indoor space. Otherwise, it just feels like it's outdoors, right? But if you get that, if you compress that outdoor space enough, and you surround it by indoor space, it actually feels like it's part of the indoor space.
Yeah, well, I had a listing not too long ago, and it was Ozzy was the architect.
Oh,
And
cool.
the neat thing about this one, a lot of his work he does, he brings the outdoor in and indoor out, or having the doors all open up to courtyards and everything. But he did do a neat, I'll send you the photo so you can see
Please do,
it.
yeah.
He did do a neat indoor kind of setup where when you walk in, it has a sunken living room, and from the sunken living room behind it, it has plants and rocks and everything there, and it's actually all inside. And above that rocks and the plants, there's a glass top to it. And
Yeah,
so it has,
I don't know the particular building, but that sounds, I would love to see that.
yeah, so it's a really neat, not only that, but there's an actual window to that living room from the master bathroom. So when you're
Cool.
in the master bathroom and you're looking out, it looks like you're looking outside, but you're actually looking to
yeah.
the living room. So you would actually close it up a lot because then people would see you.
Yeah.
But the concept, you're looking outdoors and you feel like you're out, like you're looking outside, but you're actually looking into your living room.
Yeah,
So
that's interesting. I have not seen that, but I mean, there is a concept of sort of indoor landscapes. It's usually not quite so literal as that, but I'm actually arguing that there's nothing like the real thing, the real natural outdoor. That you can have a plant, but that plant isn't going to move naturally unless it's exposed to the wind or the rain or whatever, right? So I would strongly, prefer that that movement be generated naturally and come indoors through visual or acoustic projection, rather than, because I can guarantee you that the plants that you're describing, it's not a critique of Osipov, but they're not going to move naturally, right? Unless, of course, you open up all the windows and then the wind.
Ozipov is very well known for great ventilation, and he built that home for that. So I'm sure that on a breezy day that. Yeah,
I mean, that would work absolutely, and that brings me to a really important point. I mean, that can be done absolutely and should be. I've never turned on my air conditioning for the last 18 months at least here, because I don't need it. What is it now? It's 80, 82, 83 degrees, and I'm perfectly comfortable here with the breeze that you can see, right? And the window is wide open, and I'm lucky enough to have good cross ventilation, so I don't need it. And yet I'm surrounded by people that are running their ACs, right? Which is not only not good for them, because they're running them through ducts that are full of dust, etc., in many cases, and other pathogens, but extremely bad for the planet. And this is being replicated, and it's about to be exceeded in places like China and the rest of Asia, who basically say, well, yeah, we just put a box on here and we don't see the consequences of what it's actually doing to the environment. Not only is it pumping out hot air, but it is, the generation of that electricity is contributing greenhouse gases as well. So that brings me to.
It's pretty crazy over there with their air quality as well, where you almost want to have AC at this point. So it doesn't.
Yeah, it's a double-edged thing. I mean, I'm with you. We are very fortunate, right? That we can open up the windows and we're not going to, asphyxiate ourselves with, right? And I totally agree. There are places in the world the answer to that is not to say, well, too bad, let's just ruin the environment more. It's clean up those sources of fossil fuels so that everybody, it would be a virtuous circle. First of all, you clean the air so people can open up their windows so they don't run the AC, rather than the vicious circle where you're going to go, well, the air is disgusting, so I'm going to have a super duper and make it worse. Yeah. Eventually, you're going to have to go outdoors and you're going to be breathing. What are you going to do? Wear a spaceman suit? That's where we're going, right? Because the air is a disgusting soup of toxins. So, to me, the ultimate solution is we've got to protect that wilderness out there, the atmosphere, not the green stuff. Without the stuff that we can't see, right? The transparent atmosphere that makes our planet blue. Without that, there's no green at all, right? So the most important wilderness is the one that we don't actually see, but it's moving and it's wild, right?
But one more thing before we, jump off, I thought was very interesting because and then you can explain this in more detail, but what's been coming up more frequently now, I would say, in the green space and green building is the biophilic design. Yeah. And so I know you had a different take on that. And since you're talking about the atmosphere, maybe you could add on to biophilia.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, of course, biophilia, the love of and the idea that contact with green nature is beneficial to us is a great, and I have no problem with that. It's just the term because, as I hinted at just now, nature is more than just the green stuff we see here. It's or even living creatures, plants and animals. Without the atmosphere, which many argue, that the planet is an organism. It's one big organism, and the atmosphere is the biggest, organ, right? Because without that, there are no plants and there are no living animals either. The atmosphere is what sustains the vast majority of them. So that my nitpicking with the word biophilia is it's too narrow. The word that I've heard and prefer is ecophilia. It's not as catchy perhaps, but it does include everything that's natural and not just the obvious stuff. As I said, there's no greenery without the blue atmosphere and the blue oceans. One last thing, Christina, before we go off, there's a big overlap between the three elements that I've been focusing on for the psychological and human and physiological benefits of building occupants. There's an overlap between sunlight, wind, and rain, and their movements being psychologically and physiologically beneficial to us in otherwise static indoor environments. But that overlap is with what I and in the architectural profession call passive environmental controls, which you may have to translate. Maybe I can translate, but basically anything unlike AC that does not consume electricity or another form of power. So natural ventilation, you were talking about Osipov, absolutely. Daylighting instead of artificial lighting, because artificial lighting, especially in office environments, generates enormous amounts of heat. Mm-hmm. Then you have to turn up the AC, and it's a vicious circle, right? I see parking structures throughout Honolulu on days like today with electrical lighting on all day. And I don't think the cars care, right? That is about as wasteful as, it's not just burning dollars, it's burning our atmosphere, right? There's no need for that. It's just poor design. It could be naturally lit, right? And it would be better for us and better for the planet. So there's a big overlap that the natural indoor animation that I'm encouraging is a way not only of helping ourselves psychologically and physiologically, but also of drawing attention to things like shading, natural ventilation, daylighting, passive cooling, rainwater harvesting, which at the moment, they're proven to be very effective means of saving energy, saving money, saving the planet. Three really big bottom lines, but they're underused very often because they are so passive that people don't notice them.
Mhm.
So these natural animation techniques are a way of drawing attention to shading, drawing attention to daylighting, drawing attention to natural ventilation, passive cooling, rainwater harvesting. And once a conversation starts, then, especially with a younger generation, somebody might say, well, that's cool, what is it? And that begins a conversation which ends, hopefully, with, well, the reason why it's a good idea to turn the lights off during the day is because those lights cost money, but the main reason is that they cost the environment, which ultimately will cost us the ultimate price. So I hope you can see that it begins, or these conversations, they don't all have to begin with the dreaded starving polar bear, which, just makes me want to cry, right? And makes me feel helpless. They can start with poetry, things that are beautiful, but they can go to the same place, which is, this is beautiful. It's also absolutely essential to our continued existence, right?
Now, have you, before we literally jump off, have you either designed a home of this caliber, or maybe is there an example that is out there that uses, I mean, it would be really cool to see
Yeah.
what you're talking about and the design that you're talking about to go hand in hand with the actual, energy efficiency side of things. And
the nearest we got to that, it's a great question, Christina. That the examples in the book Naturally Animated Architecture they come from many different places. A lot of them come from my own house, in which I didn't design, but I set up a number of experiments to illustrate how simple retrofitting these. So I can't remember offhand, but there were probably a dozen examples in the book that come from my own house. I mean, I don't usually flag them, but I know which ones they are. But we did one set of experiments where we actually designed a prototype light shelf. And a light shelf, for those who don't understand, are not familiar, is a shelf that is normally put just inside a window that takes excess daylight and it throws it to the back of a room. So you've often, think of a typical hotel room, right? It's very bright near the window and really dim at the back. Well, a light shelf can even that out. So it's less bright inside the window where you don't really need it. And that light is bounced back. What we did was designed a water light shelf, and that sat outside the window. It's in the book. Sat outside the window, about an inch of water. It was being disturbed by the wind, so that sunlight, when it hit that, would project moving light patterns that were moving with the wind on the interior ceiling. And we put that on a medical waiting room window, and we questioned the waiting patients. And by and large, they really did appreciate they called it a positive distraction. But, the reason we chose a medical waiting room is we wanted a place where people are stressed. So waiting is stressful. Think of traffic jams, right? None of us likes, most of us don't like waiting because we want to get on with something, right? And then waiting to see a doctor and, potentially getting an unwelcome prognosis, so these are stressed people. And the water light shelf animated effects on the ceiling and floor of that space had a significant calming effect. Self-reported. We were not allowed to actually fit those patients up. There are all sorts of HIPAA requirements, for us to get there. So we just gave them questionnaires, but otherwise we've actually been able to prove with controlled experiments. So Sheila, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I do hope that we can get the recording, the video recording up, so that people that are kind of still questioning, I wonder what this looks like, can kind of put some images.
For sure. I think it would be just fine, and we'll be able to do that as well. And of course, if you aren't able to check it out on YouTube, then you'll be able to go to that website that we had mentioned. So what I wanted to say, I guess, just before anything, is there any place that someone could find you, or how do they reach out to you, or email?
Yeah, these days my apartment. I'm not going to give you my home address, but yeah, absolutely. My email is knute@hawaii.edu, and that's the easiest way to get hold of me. And I'm very responsive to email, and would be happy to respond. So there is this, the website illustrates, the one that you've just mentioned illustrates the book, and the book is available if anybody's interested. And I would recommend the electronic form, which is $20 or less, and that contains all the videos, like some 50 videos. But there is a more expensive print version as well. So again, thank you so much, Christina, for giving me this opportunity. I'm always happy to talk about this subject. It's close to my heart, and I know you need to be somewhere, so I'm going to let you go.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to wrap this up. And that's all I have for everybody today. So thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast at www.smartlivinghi.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, which is at smart_living_Hawaii, and like us on Facebook. Until next time, live smart. Mahalo.
Mahalo.
Bye.